So if you want to start an edibles company, you should go and do your research. You should go and do a course. We had a situation, we've got a lot of cannabis clubs in the country at the moment. We all know that we're being poisoned by the food industry in terms of agriculture with pesticides. But we know when we eat our fruit and veg that it's full of chemicals. I'd have to say on a local level, Myrtle Clark from the Duffer couple.
Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit at New Age Cannabis PC and watch the whole conversation on YouTube. This is the New Age Cannabis Podcast, a podcast where we take a fresh look at all things cannabis from an African perspective. Join us and our awesome guests as we talk through the endless capabilities and benefits of cannabis. Today I'm speaking with Trenton Birch, the CEO and co-founder of Cheeba Africa. He is also the founding member of Cheeba Cannabis Academy, and we'll be speaking to him about Africa's first cannabis academy and finding out about the importance of cannabis education and the role that Cheeba Academy plays in providing quality education and helping change the stigma around cannabis. Trenton, welcome to the New Age Cannabis Podcast.
Thanks, Yor. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So anyone who's listened to this show knows that the first question that we ask our guests is, what brought you to cannabis? But more than what brought you to cannabis, I want to know what brought you to cannabis education.
What brought me to cannabis, just briefly, I started using cannabis when I was 14. Not always something that's to be promoted because it's a very young age to start, and I don't think it's the right age to start, but it's always been part of my life. And I come from the music industry originally, and cannabis and music are very closely aligned. I'm a creative. I make music as well, so I've often used cannabis for mild anxiety and just to change perspective. For many years I enjoyed it, but didn't really understand what it was doing, the benefits, because we just weren't educated on those things. In terms of cannabis education, I came from the music industry into creative media education and ran a creative media school. So when I left, I really was looking for something different, and the cannabis industry was starting to slowly ignite. I'd almost started an edibles company 8 to 10 years ago because I got into edibles and realized how beneficial they were as a way to consume cannabis. But with 2 young kids at the time, very young, I made a decision it was too risky. So when I left this other education company, I looked around and what is my place in this cannabis industry, and education was the thing. So I'm essentially an educator and a purpose-driven entrepreneur. So I can't sell, but I can sell education because I believe in it. So essentially, yeah, that's how it happened.
Education is very important. And what really brought you into the education space? Why did you think that cannabis education is what would help possibly even change the stigma? Why was that the avenue that you chose?
Obviously, it was my experience, but I realized through the many years of being in education, also I'm a founding member of a music non-profit called Bridges for Music, where we built a music and entrepreneurial school in Langa Township in Cape Town. And I realized through those experiences that education is an incredibly powerful tool if used in the right way to change society, to uplift people, to empower people. I think education to a large degree, having said what I've just said, is completely broken. I think we're still stuck in this industrial revolution times where we teach people things that are completely irrelevant to modern society. We sit people in classrooms in rows. So while I think education is incredibly powerful, I also believe it's completely abused. A lot by capitalists who see it as a way of making money and are not interested in educating people, they're just interested in making cash. So I've seen the dark corporate side of education, and I've seen another very beautiful side. So in its pure form, education is what we all survive on. That's how we grow, how we build. We learn languages, we learn how to add and subtract, and we learn why there are clouds in the sky and why the earth is round, and it's the core of our existence. But it has been to some degree commercialized, and a lot of that is just meant education teaches people to exist in a system which is not working. So I think that it's an incredibly powerful tool and industry if it's used in the correct way. So I looked at cannabis because education across cannabis is very broad. You're looking at education for people who want to be in the industry, but you're looking for education for people who want to use cannabis, whether it's recreationally or for medicinal purposes. They still need to unlearn decades and decades of prohibition and lies. So I felt quite purpose-driven to change that dynamic. I'm also deeply passionate about the opportunity that cannabis has for our planet. On a medical level, to change the health and wellness of our population by going against the grain of what we've been taught from pharmaceutical companies. On an industrial hemp level, it's fact, not even debatable anymore. It's one of the most renewable resources we have on the planet and can be used for thousands of products. It's a complete travesty that cannabis has been made illegal. And I think we will look back in 10 years' time and realize how completely immoral it was that we'd allow certain organizations and certain political groups and racial groups to demonize something that is going to have and already is having a massive positive impact on our economies and continent. So I just believe that it's here to change the world, and we need it now more than ever before. The world is a complete mess, and it's been completely corporatized and overcapitalized. Plant medicine, I think, is going to play, and already is playing, a seismic role in changing the status quo of the world. Because if we don't start to change it rapidly, we are in big trouble. We're already in trouble.
So the interesting thing that I heard you say was that education teaches you how to work in an existing system. It doesn't mean that the system necessarily works. For example, we were educated for years, cannabis is a drug and cannabis is something that's detrimental and has only negative impacts and only negative side effects and not a single health or other benefit. So in terms of the education, where do you start with the unlearning around the stigma? Because that becomes the key, is you can't educate someone who isn't ready to be educated. And the only way to really get someone ready to be educated is by first teaching them to unlearn. So where do you really start that process in terms of helping them unlearn to relearn what cannabis really is?
That's a great question, and there are a few things to consider here. In terms of unlearning, we cannot beat with a big stick. We have to do it in a gentle way. We have to understand that, especially the older population, you don't change indoctrination over 50, 60 years overnight. And you don't change it by shouting at people, change it by telling people they're stupid with their opinions. You educate people by enlightening them and by making sure that you're also objective about it. Like, I'm a cannabis user, but I still believe that cannabis is a psychoactive plant. We have to be responsible. I don't believe that cannabis should be used all the time. You should not be driving on cannabis. You should not be working on cannabis. And there are things that cannabis just don't mix with. And that cannabis is also not for everybody. If you have a predisposition to mental illness, it can be a trigger. It doesn't cause things like schizophrenia and psychosis, but if you have a predisposition to it, it can trigger it. And there are lots of other things in the market freely available that can trigger these things as well. But I think it's important to understand that there's an approach that's needed. There has been, obviously a huge movement of stoner culture, which has created negative impacts. When people mix cannabis with alcohol trumps in terms of the way it has an impact. If people are ever violent from using cannabis, 99.9% of the time they've used other substances, and alcohol being one of them, which has led to that. So what we did when we first started was we thought, if we want to teach people in this industry and we want to create an industry, we need to just give education away for free. So we started by running live events. We ran a big event called the Craft Cannabis Summit at a few small venues in Cape Town, and then took it to the Cape Town City Hall. That was almost 2 years ago now, so we were quite surprised that the council allowed us to do that. And we've run webinars. We've probably run about 35 webinars in the last 2 years that are all free, and those are all about trying to debunk the myths through bringing forward a professional platform that just gives information away. So that is a slow burn, but I think in order for it to tip properly, we still do need the powers that be, the governments of this world and of our country, to make an overt statement that cannabis is not a bad thing. You look in Jamaica, recently the Jamaican government ran a whole campaign around cannabis, its benefits, and how people as a Jamaican population should embrace it. And you look at Jamaica and you think that everybody's into cannabis and you shouldn't have to do that. But in Jamaica, cannabis also has a negative reputation because of history. So they took the bull by the horns and created a television advert and embraced that. And that's when you see a seismic shift in change. And when President Ramaphosa came out a few months ago in his Sonar speech and talked about cannabis, ironically, he didn't say much more than he'd said a year ago. But more people are tuned into it, so it became a much bigger highlight. And the minute the president stands there and says that this is something that is actually acceptable, that has a sweeping, massive impact on people's perceptions. So it's a whole combination of things. And the other thing is, as an industry, we're our own worst enemies because we're not responsible. There's a lot of mavericks. You've got an illicit industry where people are trying to cross over into the legal industry with illicit sort of morals and business operational history, and that doesn't help. I look at the edibles market specifically, and I think edibles are a fantastic way to consume cannabis. They open up a much bigger market, but I still, on my travels, get given edibles with no labeling, no dosing, no measurements. And thankfully, I've never had a bad experience on edibles, but I know many people that have. And it can be so extreme that you can have panic attacks and feel like you're going to die. You cannot die because cannabis cannot kill you unless you smoke 20 to 40,000 joints in an hour or someone throws a hemp brick on your head. But the reality is that it does need that education, and we as an industry need to be more responsible. We need to make sure the customer is protected. At the end of the day, we need to protect the customer. If it's on a medical level and someone is taking it for cancer, for epilepsy, or for a very serious medical condition, consistency is important, making sure that the product is non-toxic in any way. But even on a recreational level, guys growing at home who are selling, should not be using chemicals, because at the end of the day, we all know that we're being poisoned by the food industry in terms of agriculture with pesticides. But we know when we eat our fruit and veg that it's full of chemicals. It's one thing to eat them, and we know that kills us slowly. It's a completely different thing to combust those chemicals. And we have no idea what happens to those chemicals. When you combust a chemical, it becomes carcinogenic. So even your home growers that are growing, and are putting cannabis out, so without putting clean product out, we are technically poisoning the population. And so we need to be educated as an industry to be more responsible. So education is on so many different levels.
So you mentioned quite a few different aspects of where education really comes into the cannabis industry. And like you said, it goes all the way from the users to the legislators to the actual suppliers making the product, who all need some level of education. In your experience over the past 2 years of trying to educate these different spheres of cannabis users or people who are in and around cannabis, what has been the biggest challenge you found to getting through the barriers of understanding? So not even stigma per se, but simple understanding. So for example, you're dealing with a supplier, explaining to them that they need to make sure that they do have things like dosing information, etc., on their products to make sure those products are safe. What's been the biggest challenge you've come across in being a cannabis educator?
The biggest challenge we've had, disappointingly, is the medical industry. We have content we've licensed in from a company in Washington State called Medical Marijuana 411. They're top of their game for medical cannabis content. They're accredited in 7 different states. Their content is highly vetted and cited by many different people. So the content is completely world class. But in the medical fraternity's defense, obviously they were dealing with COVID, which was a huge distraction from learning anything new. But we still find the medical industry is so slow to come on board. And obviously we now have known, as we've become wiser, and that you're dealing with an industry that has been completely monopolized by the pharmaceutical industry and completely dominated. So it is not in people's incentives to prescribe cannabis. Cannabis is the first medicine in the history of mankind that is actually being driven by the general population, as opposed to the medical and pharmaceutical industry telling us what we need. So from a medical perspective, it's been quite disappointing how slow doctors in particular have been to embrace cannabis, despite the fact that many patients are asking for it. The other challenge is that I don't think people understand the importance of educating themselves in the industry. So if you want to start an edibles company, you should go and do your research. You should go and do a course. We had a situation, we've got a lot of cannabis clubs in the country at the moment, which is the only way you can essentially get recreational cannabis, through someone growing that for you within a non-profit. And within some of those frameworks, we have a bud tender course, which has been implemented by some grow clubs across the board. Grow on Africa's one in Point that we work with. They try and push all their bud tenders in their establishments to have our bud tender certification, because what happened was you were going into these clubs, all these bud tenders, all these guys working behind the counter understood about dank weed and what all the strains were and how high it would get you, but had absolutely no clue on the medicinal side of cannabis. And these dispensaries, as they effectively were starting to be used by people who are coming to get cannabis for mild anxiety, at some points for more serious medical issues. But these guys behind the counter had no clue when it came to that. So we're trying to standardize. At the end of the day, you should not be working in a cannabis club dealing with customers if you do not have some kind of course behind you that teaches you about the whole spectrum. So the industry, I think, has also been a little bit lethargic in terms of upskilling. So it's all just a question of time and place. And I think what we have to constantly remind ourselves is that I live, breathe, eat, sleep cannabis every single day. And when we step out of that industry, the majority of the population is still clueless. So we need to understand that there's an education, that something in terms of that also needs to take place. So it's complicated and there are multiple levels. People often say to us, what is your target market? I have a very strong marketing background. So I'm used to going, the LSM is this, the race is this, the age is this, the location is that. But when I look at the students we have on our online courses and in our classes in Ravonia, our flagship campus, literally I've got 18-year-olds in there and 55-year-olds. I've got Muslims in there, I've got Jewish guys in there, I've got mothers in there. The spectrum of people who are trying to educate themselves on this industry is completely diverse.
Now, that's quite interesting that you mentioned that the participants are as diverse as you can possibly think. So of that diverse group, what are most people tending to study? What are they looking to get information on the cannabis industry? Are you getting more corporates coming in to train their bud tenders? You've said mothers, etc., but what are they looking to really learn about cannabis?
At the moment, there's an obsession around cultivation. The private purposes bill obviously opened up cultivation for people at home. So home growing is a really big thing. So we've got a self-study home grow course, which does what contact grow courses do really well. The medicinal side of the industry is growing in terms of people who want to start CBD companies or open dispensaries or clubs. But I think that there's an obsession with cultivation. What we need more is an obsession with industrialization. The government are continually talking about training hundreds and thousands of farmers. And we're like, guys, we already have an estimated 900,000 legal farmers in this country. And now you want to train more farmers. What we should be doing is training those farmers about the industry, how to make products, and about the full value chain. So I don't think we've quite got to that point where people understand that, if I'm going to have a courier company or a security company or a marketing company and I want to deal in the cannabis space and add that to my portfolio, I need to educate myself on that space, because we need all of those players in the industry. We need guys like you with your podcast. We need media companies. This is an industry. It's a proper industry. It's not just about getting stoned. There are so many different aspects to it. So I think as the industry moves forward, more and more people will understand how important it is to educate themselves and upskill themselves. And there's a real validity in doing a course. Yeah, we've all learned stuff on YouTube. But when I ran this creative media school, we used to do a music program we used to teach. Guys would come in there after using this music program for 4 or 5 years. They'd come in and do an 8-week course with us, 2 evenings a week, and say they learned more in 8 weeks doing a course than they did on YouTube over 4 or 5 years. And the reason for that is because courses stack. They are written to stack the content and the knowledge, and there's a process behind that. You're also forced to write the tests so that you're forced to absorb the content. So it's one thing to learn on YouTube, but it's another thing to learn in a course, which also is a certain amount of unlearning. We pick up bad habits when we're parachuting in here and parachuting in there. So I think formal training and education is vitally important. So yeah, I think it's just a question of time.
A bit of a sidebar question from what we were discussing, but the media. The role of the media in cannabis education or misinformation. As a cannabis educator, how difficult is it to dispel quite literally all the myths? And that's all we know in society today is myths primarily about cannabis. But how important is your general media, not necessarily just social media, but just media in general and its portrayal of cannabis and what Seth Rogen is doing with movies? And I keep mentioning this movie because it's one of my favorite cannabis movies, Pineapple Express, and How High, because they go through so many issues in such an entertaining way that you don't even realize that they're raising core issues. But because those movies aren't necessarily mainstream, they're known as stoner movies. We're pretty much the only ones who get that information. But what impact has mainstream media really had on cannabis? Where are the struggles with regards to changing the educative narrative based on what the media is still putting out there?
From one angle, this whole thing that the media keep pushing out about this being the next sort of gold rush, or the green rush as they call it, is complete bullshit. There are a lot of people that have jumped into this industry just to make money and have fallen flat on their face. This is an industry that is going to be buoyant. It is an industry where people are going to make money, but it is like any other industry. The cream will rise. The people who put out good products will survive. There's no quick money in this industry. Look at the Canadian industry. They destroyed 450 million grams of cannabis last year, over the last 12 months. 20% of their recreational cannabis is sold legally. The rest is sitting in warehouses or has been pushed illegally into the American market. They completely overcapitalized, and a lot of this was driven by media. So the media channels that are hyping this up, I think, are doing us a disservice. I've had words with certain media bodies expressing that. However, I do believe that the media have started to embrace changing the narrative. There is a lot of talk around the medicinal benefits. There's a lot of interest, apart from the kind of overhyping of the industry to some degree. I do believe that there's been quite a lot of positive stuff that comes out in the media. People often say, whose responsibility is it to change that perception? Is it government? Is it industry? Is it media? I think it's all of us to some degree. We want people to use cannabis as much as possible on all levels, because that's what our industry will thrive on. But at the same time, we also want people to use it responsibly. We also want people to respect the fact that this is a psychoactive ingredient or more medicine, and that there are certain things you just should not be doing when you're using cannabis. So I think there's a responsibility there for the media to also represent.
That's quite true. And like you're saying, at the end of the day, overconsumption of anything is overconsumption of anything, but they tend to focus on people who overconsume cannabis and get too high and are non-functional. But I hear it takes all of us to really come together to change that narrative, the educators, government, media, the normal users, to not then abuse it and then show the face that the media claims that we have. But thank you very much for your insights regarding exactly how education and cannabis are intertwined, and the importance of having good education programs in place in any country around cannabis.
Yeah. Recently there was a situation, sadly, where 15 high school students were taken to hospital because of space cakes they'd eaten. And that is very unfortunate for our industry. But the headlines were that these kids have been poisoned. And I don't know the details of what was in these particular space cakes, but poisoned is a very strong word. And being poisoned from cannabis, the two words just should not coexist together, because you cannot be poisoned from cannabis. The fact that you might be very sick and feel very ill is a case in point, but that dramatic headline, that dramatic use of the word headline, that's irresponsible of the media. Let's not go into conversation about responsible media.
That's a different discussion for another day.
Completely.
Awesome. Thank you, Trenton. It's time for the Canna Quiz. Trenton, are you ready?
I'm ready.
What's your favorite strain?
So this is always a difficult question, because I think that there are so many strains out there, and I can't say I have one that is a particular favorite strain. I do like sour diesel. I like things that are uplifting. I'm not a couch lock guy, so I know cannabis is being rebranded at the moment instead of sativa and indica are not really relevant, but I do like stuff that is energizing as opposed to putting me on the couch. I guess it just depends. I don't go out specifically to buy a strain.
Although with that said, indica or sativa?
I like things that give me energy. I'm a high energy guy anyway, so sometimes that's not always a good thing, because I can go 1,000 miles an hour and my creative brain just explodes. But yeah, I like stuff that gives me energy. I occasionally run after consuming cannabis, and I love doing yoga after cannabis. So I'm an energized guy, and so I guess if I had to swing, it would definitely be sativa.
Did an episode with a lady who does online yoga sessions curated for cannabis users. I haven't tried it yet, but it's definitely something that I need to get onto.
Yoga and doing cannabis is completely mind-blowing. I've stretched further than I ever thought I would without injuring myself, and so I would highly recommend trying it.
Favorite way to consume cannabis? Drinking, edibles, smoking?
I'm not a smoker. I have smoked in the past. Every now and then. Recently was given sort of a cannabis cigar, a small cigar, which I really enjoyed because it didn't hurt my throat. But smoking, I just find hurts me. I love edibles and oils, as long as the dosing is right. That is my preference. Vaporize, I also vaporize quite a lot. So smoking is the least. I'm actually preferring oil to edibles at the moment, because oil is a bit quicker and I can manage it more easily. Whereas edibles, there's always, unless you're dosing it yourself or the dosing is accurate, there's always an element of risk. But I do a full body high from edibles. But if I need something quicker and more active, I use a vaporizer. Drinking, I have drunk it before, but it's very rare to find drinks with cannabis here. Vaporizing and edibles and oils are my preference.
We recently had a lady who actually makes cannabis products, and she made a 0% alcohol beer and 0% alcohol gin. The gin I didn't taste, and I'm not sure how it is, but the beer is phenomenal. It is really nice. It just makes you really relaxed and just serene. It's fantastic. So I fully get it. But with that said, what is your favorite edible or food? since edibles are your favorite?
My wife makes vegan chocolate, which is not a good edible because the chocolate is so good. It's really not overconsumed. I'm a complete health nut, but I love dark chocolate. So that is my favorite way to consume an edible without a doubt. In terms of food, I don't really dose it in my food, but yeah, I'm a complete health nut. So anything healthy, to be honest.
It's for you. Who is your favorite cannabis celebrity or advocate?
I'd have to say on a local level, Myrtle Clark from the Dhaka couple. I just love and admire her resilience and her passion and commitment to this. No matter what, she's just been through so much and has done so much. So on a local level, her. On an international level, myself and my business partner are absolutely going to meet Mike Tyson and Snoop Dogg at some point. I like Mike Tyson because despite his sort of tainted past, cannabis has really helped him move into a completely different space in his life. And as a human being, I love listening to him. I love his approach and how he's changed his life using cannabis. So I have deep respect for him. Snoop Dogg, just because he's cool and I've been into him for many years. So I'd say those are the guys who I like. There's obviously lots of other people out there, but those are the kind of people on a local and international level that I have respect for.
One thing I'm finding very fascinating, and I'm hoping it will get me an interview with Snoop Dogg, is the fact that so far of the favorite celebrities international, he is top of the list.
You know what? He is a cannabis user. What I don't like is to see these artists coming out and jumping on the bandwagon for cannabis when it's not part of who they are. And this is one of the things that I guess I could call myself an OG cannabis user. There's a culture that comes with cannabis. And now you've got this whole new culture, especially if you look at the Americans who always overdo everything to the extreme. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that because the more people use cannabis, the better for the world. But it's this weird contrast between this old and new culture. And I think it's important that people who get into cannabis pay respect and homage to the old culture. And so someone like Snoop Dogg to have a cannabis brand is hand in glove. Been singing about weed since he first came out. And I think those are nice fits. But those who kind of jump on the bandwagon because it's hip and cool, most of them don't survive, to be honest. Most of those celebrity cannabis brands fall.
Yeah, that's quite true. What's your favorite capability of the plant? The medicinal properties, the construction properties, what's your favorite, like in general?
I like the fact that it gets me high, that it puts me into a different frame of mind with a different perspective. I'm able to flow in a different way mentally. I'm able to be super creative. And to be honest, life is just better with cannabis. Firstly, life is more interesting. It's more dynamic. I see the world differently. I have no issue with human beings wanting to change their status quo of their mind. I have no issue with that. Alcohol is just one of the worst ways to do it. So we're human beings. We want to explore. We want to explore different paradigms, and for whether it's psilocybin or cannabis, we're inquisitive as humans. We should be able to explore. I love experiences on cannabis. Sometimes I'll consume cannabis before I go shopping, which is not always the best thing because it depends where you go, but I'll put my headphones in and what would essentially be a boring shopping experience becomes something quite colorful because I see things in a different way and I pick up things that I wouldn't have picked up. And obviously getting the munchies and going shopping is not always ideal, but it's just about changing that perspective. And the reality is that the world we live in is in trouble and life is hard. And if we can have something that helps alleviate that pressure mentally and helps alleviate that pressure physically, then there's nothing wrong with that. And these purists that say that we should be pure and we should not be taking anything that change that perspective, I think that's all rubbish. We do need crutches. We do need things to alleviate the stress, alleviate the pain of modern society. And I think cannabis is an incredible way to do that. So the more people using cannabis, the better, to be honest. If we were to cannabis and completely replace alcohol with cannabis, and I hate comparing the two because they're completely different substances. There's no doubt in my mind the world will be in a completely different place. And we will look back in 10 years' time and we will go, what were we thinking? How could we allow people to consume alcohol and cause accidents and be violent and beat people up? But this particular plant we banned because the monopolies that have indoctrinated us, that we allowed to control it.
What's interesting is where you say that it's all right for us to basically gain control of our own minds, because if you think about it, watching TV is not you necessarily in control of your own mind. A lot of the media content does alter your mind. It becomes a form of conditioning. So
Completely.
People who think that they're in any way, shape or form altering the minds because they don't consume cannabis or alcohol or something else that's deemed as your traditional psychoactive or mind-altering substance, they forget that it's not just substances that can alter your mind. And at the end of the day, cannabis actually gives you more control over your mind to not be altered, which is it's quite ironic at the end of the day.
If you look at like doing exercise, where ultimately we create endorphins, it changes our perspective. So if we meditate, it changes our perspective. So if we need a little bit of a help with a natural substance that's completely non-toxic, then why not? There's completely no
It's
reason
a
why.
life.
We need life. Sometimes we need those armbands to float us. And at the moment, those armbands are pharmaceuticals. We all know how highly addictive they are. They don't work. They mask the problem. So it's completely something that needs to be embraced on a massive level.
I'm definitely going to use that analogy in terms of cannabis medication being like armbands in the water, and the difference between cannabis as a natural armband and pharmaceuticals, which basically keep you in the water and end up actually taking on water and drowning, whereas cannabis actually helps you float.
Completely.
It's fascinating. What is your favorite movie or song about cannabis?
It has to be Cheech and Chong. That's my favorite movie, without a doubt. That was just like a cultural revolution. I watched it again a few years ago, and that was a cult movie. So that is definitely my favorite movie. My favorite song, actually, you know what? I'm going to be completely selfish here. And my favorite song about cannabis is actually the song that I wrote called Groot Boom, which is about rolling and smoking up cannabis in South Africa, which featured Lee Scratch Perry, the late Lee Scratch Perry, who worked with Bob Marley for many years, and a rapper from Cape Town called Redondo. And it was dedicated to the late Julian Stobbs, who was the one half the Duck Couple. So that is my favorite cannabis song.
With legislation steamrolling across the continent, South Africa obviously number one, which other African country would you like to experience cannabis in? So let's say Nigeria's about to open up, hopefully, Ghana, etc. Which country would you like to experience cannabis in?
Ghana, because Ghana is just peaceful. I'd like to be somewhere where I can get high and just walk on the street, which we don't have in our country, sadly. So yeah, Ghana is technically one of the most peaceful countries in Africa. I have smoked lots of Malawi, gold in Malawi, but on the night time it's a bit stressful because you got to worry about the mosquitoes getting malaria. And then I've smoked in Swaziland as well, and in Kenya. And Ghana is somewhere I just like to be able to get high and just be able to maneuver freely, unencumbered, and without feeling threatened. So yeah, that would be my first choice, and I still haven't been there.
And that's the end of the categories.
Great, thank you. Thanks for what you're doing. It's important. We need more media out there, so really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Trenton. Okay, now, we've had a fantastic conversation. What is your final message to anyone listening to this podcast? What is your call to action?
My call to action is the industry needs to collaborate and work together. There is a big enough pie for many of us. This is much bigger than any of us can ever imagine. But we are harming ourselves and harming our opportunity by being selfish and being short-sighted. We need to work together. We need to bring Ubuntu, because if we don't, we're in a complete mess. We are in a mess anyway, but we need to look after our fellow citizens. We need to be responsible to the people who consume cannabis that we are producing, and we need to work together and support each other and build. We're a small community. People who come into this community who do things that are not in accordance with good business protocol get found out pretty quickly, but unity and working together. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be competitive against each other, but we should be honest and transparent and loyal and move this thing forward. That's my parting shot, bro.
So for anyone who wants to find you, find Cheeba, what are your social media handles? Where can they locate you? How can they get in contact with you for more on cannabis education?
It's CheebaAfrica.com. Our handle on Instagram are Cheeba Africa. We also run Cheeba Cannabis TV on YouTube. So those are the three places you can get us, but everything's through our website really. And obviously on Facebook under Cheeba.
Trenton, a big thank you to you for coming on the show and having this conversation with us and giving us more of a view on exactly how we can use cannabis to assist in changing the stigma that we currently have, not just here in South Africa, but across the entire world. Really appreciate your insights, and we look forward to hopefully speak to you again and find out how much more Cheeba manages to achieve over the next couple of years.
Cool, thanks you. Appreciate it. And keep the fire burning, brother.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Trenton.
Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit at the New Age Cannabis, and watch the whole conversation on YouTube.